what do we have? What you got for us, Gregory?
I had two interesting ones. Kind of New Testament-y. Well, it's 100% New Testament. What does Paul mean that it's better to marry than to burn?
That's a great question from Brad. And I would say it means what he says. I think he's meaning there might be a double entendre when he's talking about the context is if you cannot control your passions, if you do not have the gift of celibacy, then he says, yeah, you should get married. Paul wasn't anti-marriage. Paul actually commended marriage. He believed that it was better to be like him, not tied down. You could do more ministry, you have more opportunity, you have more focus. And a lot of people in the early church especially held that view as well. But he also recognized what marriage was created for and the necessity of it, and that not everybody was called and not everybody could accept the calling of lifelong celibacy. And so he said, yeah, it's better to marry than to burn with passion now the question I guess would be, is he just speaking metaphorically? Like we say somebody's burning with passion, like burning in lust, like just feeling it and not being able to act on it. Or does he mean acting on it and then that leading to destruction, that leading to, eternal separation from God, burning in hell. And that would be something that I'd say, check a Corinthians commentary on it. Let me pull it up. Can you see my screen?
Yep. Tell me when you're ready for me to share it.
Don't share it just yet. I'm going to try to do, this is the passage that the commenter, I think Brad asked about. I've got the Greek text here on the left. I'm using Accordance software. You could do this in Logos as well, but Accordance is just faster. So I've got the Greek text on the left. He's giving advice about marriage in 1 Corinthians 7. And yeah, I was right. It was 1 Corinthians. And he's talking about the matters that they wrote to him, which is, then he quotes, "It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." So this is, you can see the NIV puts this in quotation marks. Not every translation does, because this is all, this is up for interpretation. But the NIV translators are saying, no, this is probably one of those slogans that they were asking him to unpack a little bit more. So he goes on and he talks about, but since, and there's our word that we talked about earlier, porneia, since porneia is occurring, each man should have his own wife, each woman her own husband. Husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. This is revolutionary, by the way. The idea of the husband having any marital duty to the wife flies in the face of a lot of patriarchal cultural assumptions. Paul was no misogynist, contrary to some opinions. So then he, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Husband not having authority, but yielding. Like, wow, that's going to mess with some people's theology in and of itself. So then he goes on to say, do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent for a time. So don't be ascetic. Paul knows what marriage was created for. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am. So this is where people say, he's saying, I wish everybody was either unmarried or had the gift of celibacy or possibly both. But each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Now to the unmarried and the widows, so those who are not married and those who were married and are married no longer, I say it's good for them to stay unmarried, as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry. For it's better to marry than to, and NIV translates this, burn with passion. It is, let me scroll down over here. The Greek, this is translating one word, purusthai, to burn. So the question is, what did he mean? Is he talking about it's better to, NIV is going with burn with passion, or is it talking about it's better to marry than to burn, like to go to hell, so to speak? So I'll just give you Gordon Fee, his commentary on 1 Corinthians. Pull it up. Just so you can read one scholar, and this is one opinion on it, but Gordon Fee is somebody who I think is worth listening to. He says, for many Christians, what Paul says next has been the troubling sentence. The apostle is seen to be arguing in the preceding sentence for all singles to stay that way, then as making allowance for marriage for those who cannot remain continent. For it's better to be married than to be consumed with sexual passion. But it's doubtful whether Paul's point is quite so stark. In the first place, Paul does not say, as the NIV and others have it, if they cannot control themselves, as if it were simply a matter of self-control. Rather, he says, if they do not practice or are not practicing continence or exercising self-control. And so up here, when he says this verb, if not, they are, and this is plural present indicative. So, and it's middle. So if they are not showing self-control, not if they can't, but if they aren't. So he says, that is, the issue for Paul is not the sexual drive as such, but the sinful practice of some of the brothers for whom marriage rather than sin is to be the proper order of things. The implication is that some of these people are doing the same as some of the married in the opening paragraph, practicing sexual immorality, porneia. That is probably also going to prostitutes. Remember, he's writing to Corinth. Unlike cities like Ephesus, where like asceticism was more popular, in Corinth, debauchery was more popular. Prostitution was more popular. Corinth was a much more sexually charged culture. And so he says the antidote for such sin is to get married instead. With an explanatory for, Paul appends a reason. It is better to marry or be married than to burn. This final word is the difficult one. The usage is clearly metaphorical, but it could refer either to burning with desire or burning in judgment. And they say, see, for example, 1 Corinthians 3:15, where he talks about the builder building and then his work being burned up. And that is talking about judgment. Since both of these can be supported from Jewish sources, that evidence is not decisive. The question must finally be decided contextually and by Paul's usage in the next letter, 2 Corinthians 11:29, which is almost certainly a metaphor for inner passion, which accounts for this addition in the NIV. So in 2 Corinthians, he does use the phrase to burn as metaphorical for like burning with passion. Even though the larger context, including his earlier warning, could be argued to support the judgment metaphor, such an idea is missing altogether from the immediate context. It seems more likely, therefore, that Paul intended that those who are committing sexual sins should rather marry than be consumed by the passions of their sins. Although it's possible that Paul was himself intentionally ambiguous, so that the clipped nature of the clause was intended to catch his initial readers a bit off guard in the same way that it has his later ones, those of us reading it. In this case, what needs final emphasis is that Paul is not so much offering marriage as the remedy for sexual desire for, quote, inflamed youth. You know, this usually gets taught in youth sermon settings, which has been the most common way of viewing the text. Rather, marriage is to be understood as the proper alternative for those who are already consumed by that desire and are sinning. So that's one example of how, in this case, this is Gordon Fee. In this is in the New International Commentary series. So that's an example of how you would interact with the text and giving the different options, and then ultimately Fee lands on the one that he lands on. But hopefully that helps. And I would commend Fee's work, and there are others too. I mean, this is when you come across a passage in Scripture that you have questions about. This is, I think, the thing to do. Read the passage. If you're able, look at the original languages. If you're not, biblical software is rapidly catching up. And this is something that even sometimes in translating things, AI can be benefit to people as long as, like Gregory says, you're using it, like you're giving it the right information that can help you in terms of understanding of word, and then looking at how different scholars who have devoted, like Richard was talking about anything about Samuel. Richard's devoted years and years and years of his life to studying Samuel. So I would be a fool not to wait, like to ask his opinion on it. and to consider that very heavily weighted. It doesn't mean everything that he says is sacrosanct. He'd be the first to admit that, but it means that it should be listened to and should be weighed carefully. And so that's ideally how a healthy way to use commentaries is. And then, check what you have access to. So that is my answer, Gregory, to the 1 Corinthians question, which was a very good one. And hopefully that's helpful to some people.